the reality is that many of these people who are reaching audiences don't come from that background.
Right.
And with the Independent Journalism Atlas, like we lean towards inclusion, right? Like we want people to be in that atlas who maybe wouldn't call themselves a journalist, or like the journalism industry would clutch its pearls and go, that's not a journalist, right? Like,
if the trust is cracked, where do we stand? Who keeps score when the facts land? This is media in the margins. Media in the margins.
So first, let's start with our transparency statement. This podcast approaches journalism as a public, evolving process rather than a finished product. And we treat knowledge making as something that is developed through a dialogue, not delivered as final authority. While we do retain editorial control, our goal is to make parts of that process visible in its uncertainties, its limits, and its revisions over time. So corrections and updates will be documented in the show notes. For context, I'm currently affiliated with Oslo Met University in the Department of Photojournalism, and this conversation is being recorded on April 6th, 2026. And so with that, let's begin. For this conversation, we'll be focusing on whether independent creator-led journalism is forming a viable system or it's more of a fragile one. And we'll explore what's being built, what's missing, and what it actually takes to sustain this shift beyond traditional newsrooms. And joining us today, our special guest is Liz Kelly Nelson. How do you prefer I address you? Can I call you Liz?
just Liz. Yep, that's perfect. Thanks, Becky.
And Liz Kelly Nelson is a journalist, educator, and founder of Project C, where she researches and supports independent creator-led journalism. She co-developed the Independent Journalism Atlas, a global mapping of over 1,100 journalists. I'm sure you'll have an update on a number for me, and focuses on the infrastructure gap, shaping how creator journalists build sustainable practices outside traditional newsrooms. Did I get that right? Do you want to add
Yeah,
in?
you got it. No, I think that those are my two main jobs right now. And I absolutely love and adore both of them. And they are all parts of a continuum that leads to the same future, I hope, which is a thriving space for people who are working independently in the creator ecosystem, committing acts of journalism.
And I'm curious, how did you get interested in this in the first place?
Yeah, so I have actually been in traditional journalism, working in journalism for almost 30 years. Started right out of college and spent time at America Online in their first newsroom way back in the day, which really actually was very formative because in my first journalism job, I was connecting directly with digital audiences. And that infused the rest of my career. So I went from there to the Washington Post via what was then called WashingtonPost.com. It was a separate entity from the Post back in the day until 2009. I was there for 11 years, then did some work at USA Today and Gannett, and then rounded out my traditional journalism career at Vox.com. And in all of those roles throughout, they were always digitally facing roles, but also I tended to work in spaces where we were building something new, which is always the space I feel most comfortable in is like when we're trying to figure out something and blue skying a lot of stuff, right? Figuring out what we can do that we haven't done before. But when I was in my last role at Vox, a couple of things started happening. One, I had joined Vox as the vice president overseeing the audio team. So I was overseeing great podcasts like Today Explained. When I arrived, the Ezra Klein Show, The Weeds. Like it was a wonderful time, and I loved it. But I had shifted into a role being the vice president for all of Vox.com. And one of the things that we were working towards was figuring out as we came up on 10 years of Vox being a brand was what would the next 10 years look like? And one of the concerning things that was happening around that time is we were starting to see some of our most talented staffers leave to launch their own initiatives. Like we always had people who were leaving because they were poached by the New York Times and other outlets, but we started seeing people like Johnny Harris, Joss Fong, Cleo Abram, even Matt Iglesias leaving to launch YouTube channels, newsletters. And so as I started thinking about like, well, what does our next 10 years look like and cared deeply about Vox, I still do. I think it's an amazing brand and an amazing news resource. I started talking to them. Why are you leaving? Right? Like, why are you getting out of here? And there were a couple of things at play. One is they just wanted more autonomy. And they saw that as possible in this new world where this creator ecosystem exists in a way that maybe it didn't 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Um, and then they were really cognizant of the fact that the distributed ecosystem of platforms like YouTube, TikTok, newsletters is where audiences were going and shifting more and more. And they wanted their work to get to those audiences. Around that time, 2022, 2023, Vox was among the digital brands that were starting to see our web traffic just fall off a cliff.
Wow.
And I mean, and that was not just Vox, that was across the board for everyone. We started to see that as audiences were finding different spaces to go, as we had dealt with COVID and a lot of other hard things happening in the world, we were seeing a lot of news avoidance. So as you know, a Vox executive, I was like, okay, what do I do? Do I fight to keep these people here and try to figure out a way to do this? Or do I want to leave and go reach audiences and help journalists reach audiences in these new spaces? And I chose the latter.
And how would you, if you're defining independent creator journalists, how do you define that?
Yeah, so we have a pretty buttoned up definition that we use for both Project C and for the Creator Journalism Atlas, or I'm sorry, the Independent Journalism Atlas, which is really somebody who's committing acts of journalism in distributed spaces, right, across platforms like TikTok, YouTube, Substack, Beehive, Twitch, Reddit, wherever it may be, but doing it outside the umbrella of a legacy or established news brand. And, you know, I mentioned this a couple of minutes ago, but journalists who wanted to do something like this 15 years ago, 20 years ago, didn't have the option because the creator economy didn't exist. Like, I was one of the first bloggers at the Washington Post, and I had a huge audience, you know, and like if I had been that, and I launched in 2006, did that till 2011. In 2011, if I had wanted to leave, my options would have been, if I wanted to go independent, to launch a nonprofit, which a lot of people did, or like Ezra Klein and Melissa Bell, who founded Vox, to go find an investor and launch like a really big thing, right? It was very rare at that time for somebody to strike out on their own. The barrier to entry has changed so much so that people can use Patreon, newsletter platforms that allow for subscriber, you know, activation immediately. You know, in the YouTube space, they are eligible to, you know, once they reach a certain scale, for programmatic advertising from AdSense. And then now that is a really right place on the YouTube side, especially where creators are going after sponsorship and brand deals. So, you know, like, would Liz, like in 2011, have liked to have been able to do that? Yes. So maybe in a weird way, it's like I feel a kinship with a lot of these creators, right? Because I'm like, I get it. Like, you want to go do your own thing.
And is this space, this system, is it sustainable? Is it thriving? Or how do you see it kind of evolving or moving?
Well, that's funny because, like, in your intro, you were like, is it thriving or is it hard to sustain? And I was like, it's both of those things, right? Really is. So, one, it's exploding. I mean, and that's part of why we launched the Independent Journalism Atlas, was because and we're still like at about 1,200 creators in the Atlas. We're going to add another tranche of about 1,000 before the end of this month. But part of what we wanted to do was to capture the scale that this is happening at, because we need to do a few things. One is we need to just recognize that, like, these independent creators are becoming these go-to sources for people all over the world in the way that they are understanding the news and how it impacts their lives. And so that's the way it's exploding, right? We're seeing it every day. Like, you know, the Washington Post had layoffs in February, and a day later, like, half the people laid off were launching Substacks. And so that is something we continue to see. What's hard is that it's difficult to get to the point of sustainability, like, financially. And you know, so that was the other reason behind, especially the Independent Journalism Atlas and showing that scale, is because it's a cool database where you can find things, but the Atlas wasn't designed really to be consumer facing. It was much more designed to be a useful tool for the industry, for funders, for technologists, for sales teams, to see there's like a real like group here to build a business around, right? So to start building the infrastructure. And so you see things like, are you familiar with Trust Fund, the new product from Michael Jarjor, where he's now
I'm not.
okay, so it's really cool. It's Trust, TRUSTFND. And he is trying to make it easier for these creators to actually make money and attract subscribers. So he launched actually a couple of weeks ago a tool where creators who have similar content and similar audiences can actually bundle their content, their brands together and basically say, if you want to subscribe to me, you can also subscribe to these other two people who create content that is similar to what I do in a way to try to make it easier for the consumer. And that's the kind of creativity that we want to see. We also do a fair amount of talking with funders. Funders are incredibly interested in the independent creator journalism space, but they are also risk averse, right?
Yeah.
Like they don't want to fund anything that could come back to bite them in the rear end or affiliate them with something that they don't want to be connected to. So a part of it was to also be able to show funders these are creators who meet a level of credibility and rigor and journalistic practice that you can feel comfortable about working with. And so, that's led to things like we're doing some work right now with Press Forward Chicago here in the United States, where not only are we helping to identify and map the creators who are working in the Chicago region, we are also working with them to develop what their grant making process will be like for creators. So, all of it kind of builds on itself. But it is like, I think to circle back to the original question, it
Yeah.
can be hard to make money doing this in a sustained way. And I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that. But yeah, we need to keep building because I don't think it has to be as hard as it is.
Yeah, I think that's what I've heard from people is probably the most difficult thing. And the second most difficult thing for young journalists or not as established journalists and consumers is, who do you trust? And so part of my research is trying to kind of pinpoint possibilities in this kind of, when you move from legacy media to a more independent structure, how do you trust people who's authentic and who's following an ethical standard? Or
Yeah.
how do you think or respond to that?
I think about that a lot. Certainly with Project C, most of the folks that we work with Project C, and we have a community now of over 200 people in the Project C Slack community, are journalists, right? They come from a journalism background. So it's easy to know like these people get trust, right? Like they either have a journalism degree or they came out of a news organization where that was kind of baked into what they're doing and they're carrying that with them into this new space. The reality is that many of these people who are reaching audiences don't come from that background.
Right.
And with the Independent Journalism Atlas, like we lean towards inclusion, right? Like we want people to be in that atlas who maybe wouldn't call themselves a journalist, or like the journalism industry would clutch its pearls and go, that's not a journalist, right? Like, because we do need to recognize that sometimes somebody who does not like come across as a journalist can actually actively build trust more with an audience. So,
And perhaps reach different audiences.
right, and reach different audiences. Yeah, exactly. So that presents like some interesting things. So one is like there's a methodology page, how we did this page on the Atlas that explains who we include and who we exclude, right, based on a few different or many different factors. But there's that larger question about what trust looks like in the creator journalism space and even the news influencer space. And that is something that I have been working with some regular usual suspects on for the last couple of years, and there are others as well, but like one organization that I partner with regularly is called Trusting News, and they are wonderful. They've been working for 10 years in the US, like working with newsrooms on how to build trust practices and what that looks like. And in the last 2 years, what's wonderful is they've just been great and very open to partnering and trying to figure out how do we widen the aperture to bring creators into this space. So we did 2 years ago, we did a short survey and research project where we talked to creators about how they build trust with their audiences. So I've been working with a group called Trusting News. They worked with newsrooms for the past 10 years, and now they are really expanding to think about how do we build trust practices into this wider space where there are people who are coming from journalism backgrounds, but also people who are not. And what does it look like? So there are kind of two sides to the coin. One is working with creators to help them understand what best practices are. And many of those are modeled on just like the same things that we've been doing for years, cite your sources, transparency around funding, like all of the things that you would find in a traditional like SPJ code of ethics, which is usually where we start when we're defining that for a newsroom. Where that shifts, though, is with the SPJ Code of Ethics, there is this clause, and I think they're even reconsidering this, but there's this clause around impartiality. And that is a big change because there are many studies that show that the loss of trust in media, which by the way, in the United States is at an all-time low. It's at 28%, like down from a high of 74% in the 1970s. A big part of that loss is a perception of bias. And this trust that was broken because many news organizations still, and I've worked at many of them, and I know that this to be true, many news organizations still will say, we're impartial. We're not biased, but it's very clear from headline choices, who's being interviewed, story selection, photo selection, that there is implicit bias. So it's just like this pact with the public around that trust has been broken. On the other end, you have people who are doing this creatory kind of journalism, who it's often very personality based and like building this parasocial relationship, but they are also usually quite open and transparent about how they feel about a particular issue or topic. And that is actually seen by audiences as more trustworthy than saying you're impartial, but modeling that you're not. That's part of like what many right now are trying to navigate. How do we redefine that for the
Yeah.
creator space? Because in my mind, it doesn't make anybody less credible or trustworthy as a journalist if they admit, that they feel a certain way, that climate change is real, right?
It's just
Let's figure out
being
that, move on.
authentic and transparent about who they are, and that's the story they're coming from or the background they're coming from.
Right. That's exactly right. So that's a big one. Like the rest is all the same.
Mhm.
Where we have seen some friction, in other ways are we talked a little while ago about how hard it is to make money in this space. And there are a lot of bad actors offering money to these folks. And by bad actors, I mean dark money that's coming from the left and the right and other sources who want to fund these journalists. There was a piece that Taylor Lorenz wrote in Wired Magazine earlier this year about this, about a funder called Chorus, who was offering money. They were a left-leaning, politically aligned organization, and they were demanding that journalists who they gave money to create content around certain topics with a particular lean, but also required that they not reveal their funding. Many journalists would understand immediately that's a red flag and it's a no-go. But when you start talking about people who don't come from a journalism background or are young, we have a lot of young journalists who are coming out of J school that are doing this because they can't get a job in a newsroom, like that is a concern. So, we continue to, yeah, we continue to try to educate around that piece. The other side of the trust thing and the part where there's really much more for us to learn as journalists is how trust is built with audiences in the creator space, because it is very different. It's a much more organic relationship. It's usually much more engaged. Most of the most successful journalism creators have a very active, open relationship with the communities of followers or readers or viewers around them, which is wonderful to see. I mean, I don't know about you, Becky, but I grew up in the age of the newsroom saying, like, don't go in the comments. It's a garbage fire, right? And so we avoided them. And I think something was lost there. And wisely, creator journalists have figured out, like, that's how you build loyalty with these audiences and trust.
Certainly a dialogue, and I'm curious if you've noticed anything in response to or perhaps any collaborations or changes in the legacy newsroom with the rise of these creator journalists.
Yes, certainly. Yes, I think we are at the phase. Everybody's familiar with the phrase pivot to video. That's happened like two or three times in the journalism industry. I think right now we're in the pivot to creator, right? Where every news organization is starting to realize, oh, we need to have a creator strategy. I was at the Online News Association conference last week here in Chicago, and 2 years ago, we had to struggle to get a creator journalism focused session on the agenda. This year, Project C curated 12 sessions at ONA about creator journalism. And much of that was driven by the fact that the journalism industry has woken up to the fact that like this is really a force and this is where audiences are going. So traditional brands also want to figure out what do we need to do to be reaching those audiences. So there are ways that we see traditional news organizations starting to try to model their behavior and their connection with audiences around how creators work. And there are some good examples. One of the best examples that I have is there's a newsroom in Memphis, Tennessee called MLK50, Justice Through Journalism. And what they've done is they have a program called the Creator in Residence program, where they've brought in someone who is a independent creator in Memphis, Amber Sherman, and they now partner with Amber and create collab content every week. I think they do 2 pieces of content every week on Instagram and TikTok. And they've been doing that since last May. And that has driven an increase in engagement for MLK 50 of 664%
Wow.
on their Instagram and TikTok accounts. So it's great. So for me, like that's a fabulous example.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of other partnerships like that that are cropping up. But then you also have examples like the Wall Street Journal here has started a program where they're trying to work with in-house talent to try to have them create more vertical video content and to work more like creators and to, take a more casual approach perhaps to like how they're producing content and that will work for some of them, right? Like, I
Yeah.
think that the jury's still out, right, on how far we get. I talk to a lot of journalism students. I'm a fellow at GW University,
Okay. Yeah.
and I was there a couple of weeks ago talking to one journalism class and asking them about like, oh, have you seen like, traditional news voices show up like on TikTok and Instagram, and they were giving me examples of like local news broadcast journalists who they said were doing vertical video and they said it was cringe. So, so we'll see. We will see like if it passes the sniff test, right? For really the target audience, which is Gen Z and Gen Alpha.
Yeah. And I'm curious if you can kind of, if someone's looking, who do they follow? Who should they give time, money, energy to in the creator journalism space? Do you have recommendations for finding someone? And also, what's the difference between perhaps a independent content creator and someone who skews towards news influencer? Or do you distinguish between the two?
Yeah, I do. My co-founders of the Independent Journalism Atlas and I, before we did that, we collaborated on something last year called the News Ecosystem Map. I can send you the link to share with
Oh,
your
yeah.
audience. And it is basically almost like a taxonomy, right, of like news sources that consumers have. And it starts on one end with like traditional news sources. And as you creep to the right across the map, it gets to newer and newer and newer. And so at the far right are creator model journalists, news influencers, and AI generated news. And the difference that we draw between news influencers and creator model journalists are creator model journalists are working journalistically. They're often doing first person reporting, explanatory journalism. There's sourcing happening. They're working rigorously. All of the things we were just talking about in terms of like building trust and credibility. News influencers, I really just see more as like the opinion section of the internet. Right. Like, and it really is a varied experience where there are some people, like V Spear, who does Under the Desk News, who I would qualify as a news influencer. V probably wouldn't, but I do. And, really is giving their take on what's happening in the news and in the world, but does it in a way that is responsible. But there are also people who are doing it very irresponsibly or are just people who get, in front of a green screen with their cell phone and are talking about like their take on a recent article that they read. So when you're trying to navigate that, that's hard. The work that I do with Project C, the work that with the Independent Journalism Atlas, all of the work that others are doing, like the News Creator Corps and others to make sure that there is good content getting into these algorithms is like a tiny drop in the bucket compared to the amount of content that's available. And so that's when it gets scary, right? Like, because we can only do so much, right? Like I told you, I'm working with 200 journalists with Project C. We've got 1,100 with 1,000 more coming into the Atlas. And that's just in the US. Like, forget about globally, which we're expanding into as well. News Creator Corps does cohorts and is working with, folks who don't come from news backgrounds and getting them to work in more journalistic ways. But for every single one of those people who we have touched or have verified, there are probably 100 who are not. And that is what is getting into these algorithmic feeds of, like I have a 15-year-old son. And so I'm very obviously curious about what he's, learning about the world. And his primary news sources are YouTube and TikTok. And the algorithm is feeding him stuff that is not approved, right, by Project C or the Independent Journalism Atlas. At a certain point, what we do, it stops at a certain point being effective. And the other half of the equation that needs to happen is this education around news and information literacy
Right.
for consumers. And so the piece that I look at that we contribute, with the work that I do is at least modeling what responsible information looks like. So my hope is that when my son and his fellow peers, fellow 15-year-olds see Joss Fong or Amber Sherman, right? Like that they recognize that there are things that they are modeling and doing. Like, here's where I got this information from. I am citing this person. I don't take money from, special interest groups. That when they see people who are not doing that, they'll go, oh, I wonder, are they legitimate? Right. But it scares me a little bit because there is not a lot of news literacy education happening for young people anymore, certainly not in the United States.
There is a bit of a hole where the creative news ecosystem has catapulted really fast forward, much faster than education has a tendency to move.
Yeah. Well, education and then the other people who could be wonderfully helpful at this are the platforms themselves.
True.
But they tend to like, I mean, they've been there and done that and tried that and in most cases stepped away. Although there are some great examples of folks at some of the companies who are doing very good work to try to make sure there's credible work showing up on their platforms.
Definitely. I think that's the most difficult, knowing what's credible versus just entertainment.
You were talking about the difference news versus entertainment. I think that's actually an interesting thing. Um, you know, just to talk about that for a
Yeah.
second, they're part of like the news avoidance trend. Like, it's not just bias, it's also people actively feeling that traditional news coming from media companies is dense, inscrutable, boring, not relatable. So that's the other parts and reasons of why creator model journalism and news influencer content has popped is because it's the opposite of all those things. Right? It's very relatable. And even when a lot of these creators are, especially video creators, when they're creating content about tough things, it still feels a little bit like entertainment, right? Like it is relatable. Somebody like V Spear, who I mentioned, is doing it from under their desk. So it's got this shtick, right? Dave Jorgensen, the former Washington Post TikTok guy who's now out and independent, grew up watching The Daily Show and The Colbert Report and believes like there's this powerful marriage between humor and journalism and opening people's minds using humor. And so I think that's actually a really important thing to recognize is that it's okay for news to be a little bit more entertaining if we're going to reach more minds that way.
That's a really, really great point, and I don't have that currently as a discussion point. That was happy accident, but I'm
Oh,
glad
good.
you touched on that. Yeah. Do you want to touch on any difference between multimedia independent content journalism and text-based content, or is it kind of mushing into one?
Well, yeah, actually, I could touch on that. So most of the folks who we have in Project C and most people who are coming from traditional journalism backgrounds are writers, right? So if you look at most newsroom, the largest group of staff are people who are reporters and writers. And so as we've seen round after round of layoffs and people looking to, who are leaving newsrooms, what we're getting is a flood of people who define themselves as writers moving into the creator journalism space. And so usually the first move that they do is to launch a newsletter. And that's great, right? Like, there are platforms like Substack and Beehive that exist for that and will be there to support you pretty quickly. Um, And that's great. You're going to reach a certain audience with newsletters. The younger audiences, the audiences of the future, are not primarily consuming news in text or in their inboxes. It really is video. Derek Thompson wrote a piece in The Atlantic, I think it was late last year, where it was like everything is TV, and talking about how like really that is just the surface of the future. Like no matter what kind of screen you're on, that's how people are most commonly consuming content. And so what we're seeing now, is there are a ton of native video creators, whether it's on TikTok or YouTube or Snapchat even, who are building massive scaled audiences. But you're also now starting to see that wave of writers realizing we need to know how to make video. And so they're, like for like the Project C community, we had TikTok come in and did a 4 session workshop teaching our folks how to make vertical video. There are apps like Sophiana that is launched that like make it easy for, crusty old journalists or crusty young journalists, even there are a lot of them too, to actually make quickly effective vertical video by teaching them how to quickly find hooks and then use a teleprompter to get their video out there. So yes, it is all blending together, but it is blending together differently than I thought it would, right? Like it really is like these people who are very comfortable in the text space who are now like moving into the video space, which is one cohort. And then the other cohort of the people who start in video who really don't want to write are realizing that because their primary platform is video, they don't have a lot of first party data about their audiences. So they actually need like a newsletter or a website or some way to gather that data so they own their audience relationship. So
Interesting. So a little of both would go a long way for everyone.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, we strongly encourage at Project C folks to be poly-platform, to be working across multiple platforms, to choose whatever their primary platform is, but to make sure they have a presence elsewhere because chances are the audiences are going to be different across those platforms. And so like, your non-primary platforms essentially become lead gen for you. The other thing is, back to kind of like the sustainability thing, even though everything is TV and video is like the dominant ascendant model, that can be one of the most difficult for journalists to monetize. YouTube is the only reliably monetizable platform at this point because of AdSense and because there's like a well-oiled machine of sponsorship deals. But, you know, journalism, even from traditional news organizations, especially if it's like investigative or accountability reporting, has always been difficult to sell advertising against. And so even on YouTube, you're not going to have sponsors lining up to like, sponsor content about ICE immigration raids, right? Or the war in Iran, right? Like that's still going to be a hard thing to do. So you need to figure out what are the other sources of income. And then the platforms like TikTok and Instagram Reels were developed for, at least in terms of monetization, for like lifestyle and like, product influencers. So the way that like, creators writ large make their money there is by selling merchandise and like, doing brand deals with products to like sell their, skincare stuff. And that's not working for journalists. So, I think especially for TikTok, I would love to see TikTok develop an alternate monetization scheme that is specifically for news creators or people who are not just selling stuff, right?
That would be great, like a subset where someone can click in and participate in that way. I am curious if you have other ideas of structures maybe we haven't thought about. And it doesn't have to be a reality, but maybe things that are up in the atmosphere that would be nice in order to make more sustainable models for creator journalists.
So many things. Like one is we need more kind of bridge funding for
Okay.
folks. I wrote about this on Friday in my newsletter, but about many things about the sustainability. And one of the things is that people tend to think like if I have like 6 months of severance pay or just 6 months saved up, that's enough. And like 6 months is all it will take for me to ramp and be making a good money. It's not. It's more like 18 months to 2 years. Right. So like we need more like accelerator programs or, just like collectives like that are willing to help provide money or some sort of shared services to make it easier for people to get up to cruising altitude and stay with them over that time. We definitely need more like that trust fund app that I told you about earlier or product. Like we need more just like innovative revenue models, right? Like ways to help these creators realize some income in a way that doesn't feel extractive. Substack is a very easy platform for people to get up and running on, but if your subscribers coming to you on Substack through Apple News, 30% of your every subscriber fee is going out the door because Substack takes 10% and Apple News takes 20%.
Okay.
So we need some different platforms that are not quite as extractive. And then I think we need to like be really creative. And we've seen examples of that with some creators, who have like these really interesting ways that they figured out to build on top of their brand and create something different. An example that I always love to use is this guy named Matt Brown who writes a newsletter called Extra Points. And it's about a thing that like I never would have known was a thing. It's about the business of college sports. So one right away, that tells you exactly how niche you can and should be as an independent journalism creator because you're really looking for some like your audience that cares about a very specific thing. And Matt Brown has found an audience of people who care about the business of college sports. And they're all people who work in like university front offices and in sports programs like coaches, right? And so they want to follow him. But what he's done is like in the course of his reporting about college sports, he's submitted hundreds and hundreds of FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests over the years to get things like what are the salaries in every college front office that people are being paid? Like how much are they paying for equipment? All of this. And so he has all of that and he put it in a database. And I think he charges something like $200 a year for people to have access to that database. And that's now the biggest revenue driver for Matt Brown.
Wow.
Yeah. And so it's like figuring out like what are the other creative ways I can do this. He also has 2 games that he's created that he's vibe coded that he charges money for and people love them. One is a simulator where you become like a general manager of a college football team. And that's actually actively used by a lot of college programs, like where they're training people to like work in sports offices. So there are non Matt Brown examples of that too. But I think it's like really thinking creatively, especially if your niche that you write about or create content about is something that has a B2B audience, like think about like what might you be doing that would allow you to generate some extra income that way too.
That's a good idea. And that's a fun, really exciting example of how someone could think differently about revenue opportunities rather than the common TikTok, Instagram, or YouTube options that are out there right now. Do you have any other stories that you want to
Oh my God, there's so many crazy, surprising things.
Hey, this is a non-commercial commercial, and the only break I'm taking in this entire podcast to make one request. If you're enjoying this content, guess what? We're not getting paid for this at all. So it would really help us if you would share, subscribe, follow, like all of those fun things that take a couple seconds, a minute of your time, means so much to us and technically doesn't cost a thing. So with that, back to the show. Thanks for listening. Oh, I almost forgot. I also would love you to comment. Let us know what we're getting right. Let us know what we're getting wrong and what you'd like to see more of.
I mean, like, one thing that I didn't mention earlier is, especially like when it comes to like people thinking like, oh, I only need 6 months and then I'll have enough subscribers to like pay my rent, whatever. Out of, if you're writing a newsletter for paid subscriptions, the, average of the amount of people who will become paid subscribers is only 5% of your overall subscriber number. So, for people when they're contemplating this, you really need to think very seriously about what scale do you need to get to if like that's what you're relying on. So somebody like Chris Saliza, who writes a newsletter, a Substack called So What, Chris has enough subscribers and he actually has a higher rate than 5%. He has 14% of people who become paying subscribers. I think he has something like 200,000 followers overall, but that for him, it's enough, right? Like it actually does, like the math works and he's able to sustain his life just writing that newsletter. But I think it's often surprising for people. Like they don't realize like, oh, that's a thing, right?
True. And what about news you listen to and tune into? where are you getting your news?
Well, yeah, I mean, not surprisingly, I have a heavy diet of industry-facing, navel-gazing newsletters and podcasts that I listen to, right? So everything that's expected, like Status with Oliver Darcy, Breaker Media, Semaphore, and Puck. But I also have my ear to the ground in the creator space. So like a lot of like published press, and the guys who run the newsletter conference in the US have a new newsletter called Who Sponsors Stuff. Casey Lewis, who writes a newsletter about Gen Z and Gen Alpha now and kind of where they're spending time online. All of that contributes to my diet for what I'm paying attention to. I keep my ear to the ground in the Project C community. They are often like a great source for what's going on and what they need and what is like the latest challenge that we need to think about. And then increasingly I'm paying attention to the tech space, right? Like a lot of this is very tech inflected, especially right now as we've seen AI kind of ascendant. It has become a real factor for many of these folks because they're often working independently, right? So if you're a solopreneur, it's much easier to run a small business if you're using AI in the background. So part of what we've been doing over the last several months is trying to figure out what are the AI best practices for creator journalists, right? And what that looks like. So I wrote about that a couple of weeks ago as well.
Are there a couple of things you want to point out or about?
Well, yeah. One, it is a great solution, depending on whatever AI platform you choose for like running the business of the business, right? Like figuring out how to do quarterly taxes or like manage, invoicing, like all of that stuff. Like you can at this point work with something like Claude Cowork and have it set up as basically like your executive assistant. So you don't have to hire somebody to do that. It's great for reminding. It's great for going through everything that you've kind of been sifting through your brain as long as there's a digital record of it and making sense about all of that. Where it is, I think, where we're on the cusp and where a lot of the discussion now is like, how much can it or should it be used with actual content creation? And there is a lot of there's a range, right, of like how people are feeling about that, where you have some people on one end that are just like, no way, never. Like Marissa Cabas of the Handbasket wrote about that over the weekend, that she's just not going to use AI. Marissa's wonderful, by the way, investigative journalist. Where on the other end, you have some folks, who are respected newsletter writers, and they are linked to and quoted in that piece that I wrote, but their names are, of course, escaping me right now, who are talking about, but Casey Newton is one of them, right, from Platformer, and others who are using it for things like, sifting through feeds, right, to find like trend spotting or to generate story ideas. There was even one writer, and his name is escaping me, but he's a tech policy writer who has a newsletter that's also published by The Verge. Alex Heath, that's who it is. And he admitted in the piece that he uses it for writing because he said to him, the writing is not the creative, important, like passion part of the project for him. It's the actual reporting, right? Like it's going out and finding the information. Like he's never been interested in being a writer. He's interested in being a reporter. So, it's like, I think like we're in this like messy middle right now phase of figuring out what that looks like. But what we can do right now is be transparent about how we're using it, right? Like, if you are an independent journalism creator and you're using AI in any way, shape, or form, especially if it relates to the content, I think it's a best practice to state that clearly, and to be on the record, because if you are using it, don't do anything to be transparent about it, and then are discovered, like that's going to be a huge breach of trust with your audience and, likely with anybody who you want to fund your work. So.
Very, very good point. And do you think, or what do you think are the big outstanding questions that you're hoping to answer in the next year or two that you're looking at and excited to look into?
Yeah, so the big outstanding questions are, it continues to really circle mostly around one, financial stability and sustainability. So what can we continue to do to put into place to build these back end systems for creator model journalists? And there's a lot of exciting work afoot, not just from me, but from many others that I want to support as well. Very excited and interested in and committed to the idea of like IP ownership for creators as well, right? And so that's a piece as well that like we continue to have a lot of discussions from the Atlas with technologists, right? To think about how do we make sure that like there's some sort of way that like someone's content creation can follow them no matter where that information ends up, that it stays with it. That's not a fix it tomorrow or next week kind of issue or challenge, but it's something that I think we can do. Certainly it's, think of it as like a watermark, right? Like how do we have something like that that carries forward? So I'm excited about all of that. I'm also really excited about continuing, with research. Like I love research. I have done research in the past year with Medill around news creators in Chicago, which is that work that's continuing now with Press Forward Chicago. I did a study with a group called the Video Consortium in the US about video creators, and I'm in the middle of um, study right now with a group called the Center for News Technology and Innovation, where we're comparing creator sustainability in the US and South Africa and trying to figure out, like, what's different and what's the same. And all of this is additive because it gets us to that first thing I'm excited about, which is how do we figure out how to keep building things that support these people. So if anybody's interested in that, those findings should be out by the end of this month, by the end of April. Um,
I
so
am
um,
interested in that.
yeah, so, I'm very excited, yeah. Lots of
Well,
good
when
stuff.
we release these podcasts, perhaps that and everything else we talked about all have linked in the show notes for everyone. And
Great, that would be wonderful.
of course,
Uh,
a lot of these things, it's hard to get off the ground because there's no way to do it.
yeah, that's really interesting. I was in the Netherlands in December, and, like, they were hard pressed to name even one video creator
Yeah,
working in the news space in the Netherlands.
Norway has a huge trust still in legacy media.
Yeah, that was the same in the Netherlands, yeah.
But it's the creator space is still rising. It's just not as fast. And so, like, when everyone was laid off, when I worked at Nat Geo, we all got laid off. I don't know what it was, like 15 years ago, went into freelance. They took all the staff away. That is
Yeah,
happening here now. So
interesting.
we're
So you
rising.
think that wave is gonna come.
Yeah.
That's
And I'm trying
fascinating.
to be ahead of the wave, basically.
Yeah, yeah, I gotcha. Well, let's definitely stay in touch because I'm really interested in students too. Like, like I just feel like I don't know what it's like in Norway, but I feel like the college level journalism programs are preparing students for the world of 20 years ago. Yeah, I mean, well, for better or worse, most journalism professors are retired journalists. So, I mean,
It's not really
you know,
surprising. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, it's not really like a forward-looking cohort. I mean, they are really great people with very important skills, but it's, yeah, it's a set of old world skills. Anyway,
Agreed.
all right. Well, I do have to
Yes.
run. This has just
Yes.
been fabulous.
Thank
You
you.
reach out too if
Thank
there's
you.
anything else.
I will.
Okay.
Till we meet again.
Okay, bye.
Bye. And for everyone listening and watching, if something stood out to you, you think we missed something, we want to hear from you. Please let us know. We'll log any updates and corrections in our show notes. And if this episode brought something fruitful to you, added to your thinking, consider subscribing and passing it along.